right, picking up from back where we left off in class, we're going to talk about another little demographics sort of moment in Florida history. If we look at the 1920s and its effect on Florida population, generally it kind of is like water in the bathtub when you sort of get into it. It sloshes a lot down to one end and then it kind of sloshes out back the other way. And what we're going to see is the 1920s kind of has that effect on Florida's population. There are a lot of people that come in, and there are less that, because of the busts and the other financial problems, that are going to leave. So if you look at the overall net effect, it's actually a net positive. All right, there had been, because of the 1920s, almost a 500,000 person jump in terms of population. When you look at that in terms of percentages, this is still a ridiculously enormous increase in terms of population. That meant that sort of an over 50% increase in terms of how many people were here in 1920 versus how many people were still here in 1930. So a lot of the population increase, of course, was on the southern half of the peninsula. Some of this is due to the railroads and the influence of bringing people into South Florida, but we're also going to see that there was other construction, other infrastructural construction, such as the Tamiami Trail, the Tampa to Miami road network that linked these two cities together down Florida's southwest coast, right? Now, furthermore, what you're seeing in the 1920s is while the state was still majority rural, it's becoming ever increasingly urbanized due to the fact that almost all of the population growth that happens in the 1920s is urban population growth and not rural population growth. Right? Now, if you're going to chop the state up into kind of chunks and look at where the population is happening, obviously the southern part of the peninsula is where the biggest of this is going to take place. The city of Miami is going to have this sort of enormous growth where it goes from essentially nowhere to the biggest city in the state, and that if you just look at the overall population of South Florida, 13 of the 13 new counties are created in the 1920s. 9 of the 13 are in the southern half of the peninsula. This is a little map here. You can see with this where the route of the Tamiami Trail is. It's sometimes referred to as Alligator Alley because of the alligators. I don't know, maybe they could call this like the Python path now because of the large snake problem. This is a little bit more of a zoom in, give you an idea of sort of what it looked like at this point. For those of you who've never driven this and you've never seen the Everglades, you can see it and wave to it from the comfort of your car. It's a big wet area with lots of grass and trees and stuff. This is what the some of the survey crews that were out ahead of the actual construction, trying to find what exactly the best route was to take through parts of the Everglades to get to Miami. You'll notice that off at the bottom here of the screen is a couple of Seminoles. The state survey crew employed a lot of Seminoles to help scout out the routes because who knew the area better than they did. We're also going to see that one of the problems that Florida is dealing with here is the fact that Florida's prison system was pretty barbaric in the way that it had come out of the 19th century and hadn't really changed much for the 20th century. In fact, prior to 1919, Florida didn't really have any kind of penitentiary, any sort of large-scale, long-term facility for housing convicts beyond things like, you stole something small, or you killed somebody, or if you had small scale crimes, but like murder, rape, you burned a house down, you stole like tens of millions of dollars worth of stuff. They didn't have a penitentiary system to deal with that, right? The system that the state did use, because it's not like there weren't murderers here, it's the fact that the population throughout much of the 1800s was so small that it simply wasn't cost effective. So what they would do was a program called convict leasing. Convict leasing was if you were a prisoner and if you were going to be held for an extended period of time, people would come in, private companies, and they would say, okay, we want to hire this guy, and we're going to take him way out in the middle of nowhere, so security's not going to be really an issue, and he is going to work in whatever industry that we've got, whether it's timber, phosphate, turpentine, right? And these camps would be way, way out there, so the ability to escape was really low, but also, too, these companies would employ armed guards. And the companies knew what they were buying. When they showed up at these police precincts to sort of purchase their laborers, and they knew that some of these guys were pretty hardened criminals, and they were held in pretty brutal conditions. They were whipped. They were put into hot boxes. They were left on the ground. They had barely subsistence types of food and clothing. The floors of their dwellings often were dirt. The problem with this was that these kinds of places didn't really get a whole lot of attention, but finally, some of these abuses are so bad that a few outside media outlets started doing some investigative reporting, and in 1919 we're going to see that some action is finally going to be taken. And so there are reform bills in 1919 and then again in 1923, and so Florida realized it's going to have to do something other than this, and it's going to have to take care of these prisoners themselves rather than convict leasing. But this is going to be replaced with some actual penitentiaries. But you'll still see that labor is part of the sort of the deal of the day, right? And that there was the prison farm labor system, but you also see a lot of convict road gangs that as Florida's infrastructure on roads is expanding, they wanted to use convicts to do a lot of the labor. And so that was one of the things that you would see here. Here are some business owners. They're buying convicts, right? They're going to get these guys and they're going to take them to work. These are some of these places that they would go out. Turpentine, right, which is a product of cat's face pines that you can use the sap from that to make a number of industrial products like varnish and polyurethane and a few other things. And so this was a big employer of a lot of these laborers. Now you'll also notice that a lot of these laborers are African Americans, and so you got guys, white guys with whips and pistols making black convicts work. This sounds vaguely familiar, and so this was the system. This was where they lived, as you can see, not exactly the Ritz. This was one of the main media stories that caused the state of Florida to have to really look back in on itself and say, maybe we should do something different, right? Whether this guy had been whipped to death by a guard, until eventually that whole convict leasing system is replaced by this, which was a state prison farm system, where these guys would be sort of working for themselves, but they would be held in a facility and farmed out to do their own kind of work, right? Not exactly the friendliest lot of people, but this is what you would see through Florida for decades. Is a lot of these roads were built or widened or paved by these road gangs, and this is one here in North Florida in 1922. One of the other features of the changes here was the introduction of electrocution as a method for executions for capital crimes in Florida. It was seen as more humane than hanging, and so this is the electric chair that was used for a long time at the state prison in Stark. And interesting side fact about this was the chair itself was built by the convicts here in the 1920s. And so, all right, that's it.